start on time. Probably. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello, hello? James? Is it working? Should I just yell really loud and just do that? I can do that. Hello? The captioner can hear me. Marco. Okay. Amanda, help. Microphones are hard. It's okay. We still love you. Going, I'll just yell, and maybe this microphone will pick that up. I'm not good enough, huh? Yeah. Great. All right, our next speaker received their PhD in genome sciences from the University of Washington, and they now do science communication and biotech. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Jay McCrate. Oh my God.
Whoa. I'm scared to come forward now. All right, I don't know, her mic sabotaged me. Are we good now? Well, now that you're all awake. Hi, everyone. Like Lauren said, I'm Jay McCrate. I am not the brother of a previous blogger that you may have heard of. I am transgender, and I look a little different than I did last time. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. And I know that's a little bit ironic, given that probably the thing I'm most known for in the skeptic movement is a good joke, but that's just how life goes sometimes. But yeah, it's honestly really an honor to be back here at Skepticon. The last time I gave a talk here was literally a decade ago at Skepticon 4. And I admit I didn't really put the family reunion theme into my talk itself, but it just really resonates to me that this does feel like a family reunion to me, to see a lot of people who have been my friends and mentors over the years that I haven't really seen in a decade, since some of the talks that came previously by Debbie and Greta talked about, activism burnout, and that happened to me. It's been a long time since I've really had the spoons to immerse myself in the atheist skeptic movement again after some of the stuff that happened that we don't need to unpack. We know what that was. But I'm honestly really happy to be here. I've always said Skepticon was the one conference I would come back to one day, and when I heard from Lauren it's actually happening, I'm like, here it is, let's do it. So thank you for giving me the platform to talk. All right. Oh, I guess, how do I move my slides if they are not on my screen? Wait, can I click it if I go over here? Aha, okay, we figured it out. Tech problems. I'm sorry if this image is triggering to you. For those of you who don't know or can't see it, this is Marjorie Taylor Greene hanging up a sign outside of her office saying that there are two genders, male and female, trust the science. And that's, yeah, if your reaction is, ugh, that's correct. And that's where the title of my talk today comes from, to trust the science. But I'm going to be telling you that the science says sex and gender is actually very complex. It's not so simple as just being a simple binary of male and female. And this has been something that I've learned both in my professional career. I do have my PhD in genome sciences, because that's one thing that's changed since the last time I was on stage. I've been doing science communication professionally for 5 years now, but also just as a transgender person, and if there are any other trans people in the audience, yeah, woo. There's a joke amongst our community that in order to be trans, you kind of have to have a PhD in biology, that you self-teach yourself all of the nuance that is around sex and gender because most people out there have a really simplistic worldview when it comes to this. A lot of people maybe have never had a biology class since middle school, and when you're in these really introductory settings, we don't teach all the nuance that there is involved in science. Like Peasy's talked about earlier, that even with genetics, it's not just Mendel. It's actually much more complex than that. And we teach these simple, introductory, not nuanced takes so that people who are 12 years old can get a general grasp of the concept. And there are practical reasons why it's useful to know that there are generally males and generally females. But then we have people like this. Or we have other people who are now making whole books and documentaries on what is a woman, like it's some sort of gotcha, that it should be a really simple answer to that question. But the reality is it's not simple. And now, if you're debating this person or ones like her, you're not going to change her mind. She is completely entrenched in Christian ideology, in the patriarchy. There's no reasoning with people who are so far off on the fringe of just basically hating transgender people. But I wanted to give this talk today because there are a lot of people out there whose minds you can change. And I know it can be hard if you yourself don't have a PhD in genomics and you haven't been spending decades studying the nuance involved here to even have those conversations. Like, how do I answer the question, what is a woman? Like, how is the right way to answer that? So I'm here today because I'm hoping this gives you at least some information that, again, you're never to convince the fringe people, but like members of your family who might be well-meaning, but just kind of look at the whole trans thing as being kind of weird. But they're like, well, I know they're men and women, so that just seems wrong. This seems not natural, like what's going on? And those kind of people can really be swayed by propaganda like this because it seems convincing, right? Like most people are men, most people are women. Yeah, there's sperm and eggs, sure, it seems binary. But again, it's complicated. And so I feel like I even have to caveat this talk, if this shows anything about me, that even this talk, as I was creating it, I was stressed out because even this doesn't feel nuanced enough for me. That there are probably going to be people in the audience who are either trans or biologists, and they'll be like, well, that's not totally true. That's kind of a summary. And, you're right. Again, you have to condense it to 45 minutes. I can't get into every single exception or matter of nuance. But if you can just generally take away from this that sex and gender are much more complicated than you think, that's a win for me. So, all right, one thing I'll add there is, if you think, why hasn't Jay brought this up yet? I'm probably about to get to it. And if I don't, please bring it up in the Q&A and let's have more discussions because, again, there's way more nuance. All right, so to just kick it off, sex. It is more complicated than you think. And I'm not talking about the act today. I'm talking about sex as in the concept of being male or female. And for the moment, I am just going to put aside gender completely. We're not going to talk about the difference between sex and gender yet. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she ignores the distinction, so we're going to ignore it right now too. We're just going to talk about sex. So what is, quote unquote, biological sex? That's a term that we've been seeing come up more. And I'm going to tell you up front that biologists don't really use the term biological sex. When you see those two words put together, it's really a word from the right that is supposed to insinuate that sex is true and biological, and all that gender stuff is just made up. But the reason why we don't really say biological sex is because it's not really meaningful if you're a scientist. How do you define biological sex? The right will often say, oh, it's about chromosomes, or it's about gametes, what gametes you produce. But the reality is, your sex assigned at birth is 100% due to you popping out of your mom or parent, and the doctor looks at your genitals and makes their best guess of what category you fit into. They don't look at your chromosomes. They don't look at what genes are on those chromosomes. They're not looking at your hormones. They're not looking at what organs are inside your body. They're not looking at what secondary sexual characteristics you're going to develop in puberty. They're literally just taking a look at what's on the outside and making their best guess. And that's why a lot of trans people use that term, sex assigned at birth, instead of biological sex as some sort of truth, because it's really a judgment call being made by a doctor. And as I listed all these things, again, it's complicated. It's not just one thing determining sex. And even amongst each of those individual variables, the only one that really is truly binary, and even this probably has some exception that I'm not aware about, are gametes. You have sperm and eggs. But again, if you look at chromosomes, I'm a geneticist, so this is the area I know most about. You know, most females have XX chromosomes. Most males have XY chromosomes. But there are a range of exceptions when it comes to just chromosomal sex. There are people who just have a single X chromosome, those that are XXY, those that are XYY, those that are mosaic, where some cells of their body might have some set of sex chromosomes, and other cells in their body have a totally different set. So you can have XX in some cell, XY in others. There is so much diversity, even amongst chromosomal sex, that even though it is the go-to example of how simple it should be, it's actually very complex. And even then, there are people who, cisgender women, so women who are assigned female at birth, go their whole life knowing their gender is being a woman, and they later find out they actually have XY chromosomes. And the opposite can happen for men, where they actually have XX chromosomes. And often these things aren't really discovered because, again, you're not looking at your chromosomes. People get surprised when they do genetic testing, or they hit puberty and they're not having kind of a normal developmental puberty like a woman. Oh, you're having her period. And then when a doctor actually goes and looks, what organs do you have in your body? Oops, she doesn't have a uterus, or she has testes. And all of these examples are out there. It's not necessarily a strict binary. There's all sorts of stuff going on in the middle, really. And this is why I like to say that it's technically more accurate to say that sex is bimodal, not binary, and that in general, most people fall into one category or other, but there's all sorts of diversity in between. It's practical for us to often categorize it as one or the other, but that's not actually reflective of biology. And even then, when I say these things or talk about the exceptions are actually more common than you think. Again, because a lot of people are either intersex or maybe not following into that exact definition. Again, who makes that definition? But they aren't fitting into the perfect binary, and they have no idea until later in life, or never. And so if you don't know to look for those things, you don't count those people as examples. So it's actually probably much more common for people to be intersex than we even know. Now, one thing I also want to hit on here is that sex is often assumed to be immutable. You can't change sex. You can maybe say you're another gender, but you can't change your sex. That's always going to be the same. It's biological. But for trans people on hormone replacement therapy, that is not true. When you look at the hormonal profiles of a trans man on testosterone or a trans woman on estrogen, they look more like, the trans man looks like cis men, and a trans woman looks like cis women. Trans men grow phalluses. They can get hard. They can ejaculate. Trans women can experience PMS symptoms even though they don't have a uterus. So they can experience the cramping and the psychological issues that go along with it. Trans women who are on HRT long enough can breastfeed. And all of this happens because we start in the same place developmentally. And we have the programming innate in us and in our genes, regardless of if we have XX or XY chromosomes, to really be either of those sexes. So sex can be changed. And that's why even though, you know, some people would like to label me and myself as, oh, you're still technically female, from a scientific point of view, that's not really accurate anymore. I don't match either group at this point now that I've been on testosterone for a year and a half. So what about gender? That's obviously the next step in this process. Like sex, we can assume like that's really biological, that's what's determining it. And that a lot of times in like kind of 101 level discussions, people will be like, oh, well, sex is biology and gender is psychological or cultural. And they kind of try to make this distinction that they're separate ideas, and if only we can get people to realize their difference, then that way they'll understand that some trans people have that mismatch. But the reality is even transgender identity is influenced by biology. There is a biological component to being trans. We might not know every single detail about how it works. There might not be a test to, well, that's a scary concept anyway, to test if you're trans or not. But there are a lot of things that hint towards transness being having a biological component. And I say component because, like really any trait out there, there are going to be genetic influences and environmental influences. So for even things like height, it's not purely determined by your biology. It could also be determined by your diet and upbringing, so that you had a nice, healthy, nutritious diet, you can grow taller. But there is some component of transness that is innate. We can look for information out there that hints towards this, even if it isn't fully figured out yet. One place I would start is just remembering that the brain is an organ too. The brain is subject to evolution. It is subject to all those hormones that are in your body. It's subject to gene expression. It is an organ in your body. So if you can accept that all those other variables I shared, like chromosomes, hormones, presence of organs, can be more complicated than a simple binary, you can also accept that the brain might be more complicated than a simple binary. It's yet another variable where maybe it's maybe evolution has developed in a way that most of the time people fall into one category or another, but there are going to be exceptions in between, and people who have mismatches between their sex and their gender. And one thing that we can look at to see if there's some sort of innate component, one of the first steps in genetics before you do something fancier like a genome-wide association study is a twin study. And when we do twin studies because in general, if you look at identical twins and those twins tend to share a trait more than non-identical twins, that hints that there's some sort of genetic component because those twins have the same genetics. And that is what we find for transgender people. When you look at trans twins, if you are transgender and you have an identical twin, they have a 20% chance of being transgender versus a non-identical twin has a 5% chance of also being transgender. And given that trans people are about 1% of the population, that even the non-identical twins have an increased rate because they share genetics even though they're not identical. So twin studies are one hint that we have that there is something genetic contributing here, even if it's not, again, Mendelian and simple. It's complex, but there's something going on there. Oh, it's trying to, okay, got some weird pop-up, but you didn't see that, great. Another thing that points to transness being at least partially genetically influenced is that we see transgender identity in very young children. And we really see gender identity in general. Little kids, cis and trans, know their gender identity. They have very strong feelings about it. And when we look at trans kids who even as young as 5 are saying, "Mom, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy," those feelings persist through childhood. Even despite society constantly telling them they're wrong, and people trying to get them to act another way. Excuse me. Hello, there we go. That it's in high 90%. If you are a transgender child, you're going to keep being trans. And this sort of, again, hints towards the innateness, that these children have not been influenced by culture. They popped out this way. And we also see this when we start looking at stuff like brain scans. In adults, if you scan the brain of a trans woman, her brain looks more like a cis woman's brain than a cis man's brain. And the same is true for trans men. There is something going on there biologically, again, in the brain. And it's also related to like the concept of physical dysphoria, that trans people often feel like there are parts of their body that don't really match what should be there. And like the one example that I know more because I'm transmasculine is that a lot of trans men actually experience dysphoria akin to phantom limb syndrome with their genitals, in that they expect a penis to be there. They feel like it's there, but clearly know it's not when they look down there. And it's been linked to having the similar effect as someone who's like lost an arm and can still feel an arm being there. Your brain has mapped out that it's expecting that body part to be there even though it's not. And we also see that when trans people undergo HRT, they are often much less depressed and experience things like lifting of brain fog, that they just function better all around. And the description of being, it's often described as finally having the hormones your body expects to be running on. So there's clearly something, even though we don't have a test. I hope there's never a test because that has all sorts of cultural implications. But there is something going on here that is biological. It's not a strict divide where sex is biology, gender is culture. They really are linked and related and influencing each other. Another thing that also points to transness being some sort of biological component is that it has always existed and will always exist. And I'm not just saying that as some like brave statement, like we're gonna make it no matter what, but queer people, so trans people, intersex people, gay and lesbian and bisexual people, we have existed throughout human history. And that's because we are a natural part of human diversity. We are influenced by these biological variables, and we are part of a spectrum of diversity that is going to just keep popping up. And that's why efforts to eradicate us, or things like conversion therapy, just don't work. Even if, heaven forbid, every trans person on the planet right now was murdered, there would be trans people being born in the future because it has an innate component. And a lot of people are skeptical about this because there seems to be this idea that transness is a trend, that why am I hearing about trans issues so much all of a sudden, that the last few years, all you're hearing about trans this and that, younger people tend to be trans more than older people. And so there's this concept that like, it's this modern invention from the last 5 years, it's trendy, and it's popular. First, I don't know anyone who's transitioning for popularity. It's scary to transition. Trans people go through decades often, at least I did, of denial and fear because society treats trans people like crap. Like just me speaking personally, it was a long time where I looked at trans people and I was like, gosh, I wish I could be like that. But I'm not, that sucks. You know, like, oh, I wish I could be, look, I'm so jealous of them, they can just be a man. And with time, it became, ooh, no, I do relate to a lot of what these things are saying, but I can't choose to do that. That's gonna ruin my career. That's gonna make my family abandon me. I'm gonna be labeled as a freak. And that's how society treats trans people. It's a kind of reasonable fear to have that fear. So no one is transitioning for a popularity contest. It is hard to publicly transition. But I want to go back to this idea that it's a recent trend. One of the reasons we think transness is a recent trend is, one, because it's punished by society, like I just said. And the example I always give that I think resonates with people is left-handedness. There used to be a time where you were punished for being left-handed. Kids in school, a nun would be rapping you on the fingers, and you were forced to write with your right hand. And once that fell out of fashion, the rate of left-handedness skyrocketed and then eventually leveled out once we hit this equilibrium. And left-handedness is partially genetically determined. It has a genetic component as well. And that's kind of what we're seeing happen now, in that as society has gotten more accepting and there are more examples of trans people out there and just the language of being able to describe yourself, there are more people saying, oh, this is how I've always felt, and I can finally just do it instead of living in fear. Like, it really took me, again, personally, to see people like Jonathan Van Ness calling himself, or themself, or herself, because she uses all pronouns, non-binary, to be like, oh, I'm not the only person who feels that way. So a lot of it isn't that the rate of trans people is changing, it's that trans people are just more likely to come out because they're not afraid anymore. And another part of this is that, frankly, trans history has been violently erased. There have been campaigns to make sure people don't know that we exist. And I hate to say that we're seeing it happen again now. All these don't say gay and trans bills, keeping trans kids out of sports, all of those are motivated by people who fear that if their kid sees it's okay for someone else to be trans, oh, they're going to be trans too. They don't want trans people in public. They don't want others to know that that's an option out there. And, you know, it's motivated by really Christian patriarchal norms, mostly. Like, that's where it's coming from, and that there's Adam and Eve, there are strict gender roles, and once you start dismantling that system, scary, because other things can fall by the wayside. And I think a lot of people don't even know that, you know, transness has gone back a long time. There was, I'm going to butcher this because it's German, the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaften, sorry, whoever's typing the coverage there, but it was run by Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany, and it was right before the Nazis took off, and this was like the cultural hub for trans people in the 1930s. They were already doing gender affirming surgeries to trans people. They had all sorts of research and records from thousands of years in the past of the existence of trans people through history and different cultures. And the Nazis burnt it down. They burnt all the books. And I've heard some recaps of this horrible event saying that it's really set back transgender research almost 100 years. We just lost all the past research that was ever done on why are trans people trans? What helps trans people? Magnus Hirschfeld, his #1 treatment for trans people was to literally just socially transition and be amongst trans people in a safe environment where you could be yourself. It wasn't radical. That's what the AMA and every other medical organization nowadays suggests and supports. But we had to rediscover that information because it was violently erased by Nazis. So if anyone tries to tell you that transness is just a recent fad from the last 5 years, they're just flat out wrong. We see records of transness going back thousands of years into like really early history. Now, I've talked a little bit about biology and kind of focusing on the science, because I am a scientist and that's where I focus. But you know, science doesn't exist in a vacuum. There is a lot of cultural influence on how we interpret variation. So for example, you know, if we look at hair color, pretty uncontroversial. If you have blonde hair, black hair, red hair, maybe redheads get some flack, but like, you know, we don't really treat them differently. We accept that's just natural human diversity to pop out different ways there. But you know, there are some biological traits that aren't really treated that way, even though they are naturally occurring diversity. So an argument I often run into when I'm talking about these sort of things is like, sure, transness might have some sort of biological component, but clearly it should be treated like a disease that needs to be cured. It doesn't matter if it's just part biological, because other things that are biological are disorders and diseases. And clearly we know that men are supposed to be men and women are supposed to be women, And that's what nature intended for those two to pop out babies, which also I think shows how transphobia is really connected to both misogyny and homophobia. It's all about recreating those strict gender norms, and any deviation is it's a defect. And a lot of this is just how we look at human traits culturally. Exceptions to the rule and the averages that most people fall into aren't necessarily defects. And there are a lot of traits that I think are good examples of this, that the culture is already changing. So like, for example, deaf communities, blind communities, autistic community. All those groups used to be seen as a defect that needed a cure, needed to be fixed so that you are normal. But there are deaf communities out there that don't want a cure because they have their own culture and they want their children to grow up in their culture, and they don't actually see anything wrong with being deaf. The problem is that society does not support deafness. You're not accessible to everyday interactions because it's been built for people not like you, even though we can make it so it is more accessible. That is a cultural judgment on what is a disease or not. It's not a scientific truth. It's not that there's something inherently wrong with being blind or deaf or autistic or trans. It's that our society rejects them and does not make space for those people. And on top of this, there has been, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight this, but there is intersex people. I don't want to play the oppression Olympics, but they have it even worse than trans people. Intersex people have had a long history of corrective surgery being done on them at birth as infants before they can consent in order to fit into these neat boxes of male or female, even if it has no medical benefit, even if they can urinate properly, even if they can reproduce. No matter what it is, it's just a total physical, it just doesn't kind of look right, and we want them to fit in with society. So we're going to change your genitals surgically without your consent. This has even happened in the past without parental consent. It used to be the norm. The doctors just did it. They did not have to ask anyone for consent. And that in itself makes being intersex seem rarer than it actually is, because those people were violently erased. They were changed from their natural diversity. And I will say, we're starting to see progress here in how we look at intersex issues. Coming from, again, biology world, the Endocrine Society used to call these sort of things disorders of sexual development. But they now call it differences in sexual development. So it's not a disorder. There's nothing wrong with being intersex. It is, again, a difference. It's just part of human natural diversity to sometimes pop out in the middle of the spectrum and not at either end. And likewise, we're seeing more and more countries around the world ban intersex surgeries and making it so those people can reach adulthood and consent to it themselves if that's what they want, but not having it forced on them by a medical establishment. And really, ultimately, a lot of this happens, the erasure of the exceptions, because humans are predisposed to try to fit things into categories. We are really good at categorizing things. And part of that is a useful skill. It's useful for me to say, oh, that's a tree, and we all collectively know kind of what the category of tree is. Even though if you talk to a biologist who specializes in studying trees, they would tell you that's a very complicated question of what is a tree. It is not as simple as you think, but it's useful for the average person just living their life to be able to call upon those categories without getting into a deep philosophical discussion. And we're seeing the same thing happen with what is a woman? That yes, in general, we can say a woman is this type of person who tends to have these set of characteristics that correspond with each other, but there are going to be exceptions to that rule, and those exceptions matter. They're not defects. And I think one way to illustrate this is that people have trouble conceptualizing anything that doesn't really fit in categories that we've already established. For example, bisexuals, they don't really exist. They're actually straight or gay. They just haven't made up their mind, but they'll figure it out. They're going to fit in that category. Or even biracial people. Oh, Obama's black. Even though he's half white, we just cannot conceive of what category to put someone who is half and half, let alone have more ancestries than that. We're just not very good at it as humans. It is a conscious effort to understand the nuance that is there. And we're just frankly not very good at nuance. And finally, a lot of people, they tend to think of science as this source of truth and objectiveness. That the science says this. Even my talk, trust the science. We're going to trust what the science says. But science doesn't live in a vacuum. Humans do science. Science is influenced by culture. It's influenced by politics. You have to ask yourself, who's doing the science? And the answer for the last hundreds and hundreds of years until relatively recent history was scientists were cisgender, heterosexual, white, mostly Western European men who had financial privilege. They were a very specific category of all of the diversity of humanity that actually exists. So when a scientist is going and defining how do we define sex, they're not taking into account the experiences outside of their own life experiences. They are coming up with these definitions of what a male is or what a female is based on their worldview, which again, these scientists were also mostly Christian. A lot of this comes from the whole patriarchal idea of there was God created man and a woman and that's how it is. They were influenced by that culture even when they were coming up with these scientific definitions. And this still, persists in science today. If you open any random average scientific study that involves humans, they're probably going to categorize people as male or female. And part of that is, again, practicality. There is usefulness in just being able to have categories that we can compare and not necessarily look at the exceptions. But that doesn't mean those exceptions don't exist. And the reason why most studies don't call out intersex people or trans people is because they don't think to include them in the study. Or if they are included, you throw out that data because there aren't enough people in your study to reach statistical significance to actually look at how that's affecting that group of people. And so how would you have to actually do a nuanced study looking at all the sex and gender diversity out there? You need money to go recruit more people. And there isn't funding right now to make every scientific study inclusive on sex and gender, even if it is a reality that those people exist. Our data is just thrown out and seen as inconsequential. Even worse is sometimes we are in studies and we just get lumped into one group or another. We're not even considered. They just assume we are one way, which is even worse when you consider, I know there must be some studies I'm in, because I used to participate in research as a subject a lot, that is labeling me as female even if I'm on HRT for years and I don't have the hormonal profile of a female anymore. And if you're doing a biological study, that might matter. That might matter that different genes are being expressed. And so you're actually not even doing good science anymore to ignore that aspect of what's going on. But really, one thing I want to highlight is that these standards for how we define what is a woman or what is a man, they are rigid biological standards that, again, are influenced by culture and society, and they're often impossible to stand up to, even for cisgender women. And I think the group of people who are really affected by this are black women, and really all non-white women. And that, again, the people who are defining what is a woman, what attributes does a woman have, they're white men who are basing this off an ideal of white womanhood. And we see this when we look at things like the Olympics and who gets tested for their testosterone levels and kicked out of the Olympics. It's always black women, not white women. They don't necessarily fall within the culturally defined norms of white womanhood, and so we see them as falling out of that category, even though they're cisgender women. They just have higher levels of testosterone. Which, again, even there, it illustrates why this isn't necessarily tied to science. Testosterone levels aren't actually linked to performance. When you look at cisgender male athletes, there's no correlation. It's not the guys who are pumping out more testosterone are stronger and better and faster. It's not simple. And part of this is because everyone's body uptakes testosterone differently. So even if you have higher levels of testosterone, well, maybe you're metabolizing it differently, and so the end result isn't the same. And so going and saying, all right, women, your testosterone is too high, just frankly doesn't even make sense. It's like those people aren't naturally better because their testosterone levels are higher. And really, if you even zoom out further, Olympic level participation, all those people are mutants. Let's just be honest. They are all on the edges of the bell curve. That's why they are performing at that level. Michael Phelps literally has mutations that enables him to be such an amazing swimmer. Google Michael Phelps mutation, you'll find articles that talk about this. Like, he is a genetic freak of nature, to be honest. Like, he is a very rare exception. But we don't have any problem with Michael Phelps because his uniqueness isn't breaking a gender binary that our culture is really invested in upholding. That's really where this stems from. It's not from necessarily having some sort of advantage. It's that, ugh, you're not just male or female? That's weird. That's really where it's coming from. Now, I've spewed a lot about biology, I've talked about the science, and I think I'm about to maybe undermine my talk a little bit, but ultimately, none of this matters. And I picked the image from the James Webb Space Telescope because I don't know if you're like me. When I saw this image, I was like, I am a speck. Why do I care about anything that I care about? I get a little too nihilistic. It's been the pandemic, guys. Sorry. You know, that's just kind of where my brain's gone. But like, really, even if intersex people, trans people, gay people, queer people, even if it was purely cultural, purely just a whim, I just want to do this, there's no scientific biological underpinning, who cares? If it doesn't hurt you, let them do it. I mean, we don't define ethics by how natural it is. Rape is something that has happened throughout history. We don't say that's okay because sometimes apes do it. No, we still recognize it as wrong. And when it comes to transness, me transitioning does not affect any of you. Unless you maybe want to marry me. That might have, you know, an influence, but no proposals yet, please. So really, it's like we are on a speck in the universe with all these other planets out there, all these other galaxies, and we're sitting here debating what seems like an absurd debate. Like, we evolved to be this way through a natural process. The only reason even sex exists is through evolution, and the reason evolution produced mostly 50-50 male-female in mammals, obviously we get into funguses, it gets a little wacky, it's mathematical. I'm not going to get into the details because, wow, that was the most boring class I took in grad school. Sorry to that professor. I just don't like math. But it's all mathematical. You reach an equilibrium that is 50-50. If you start getting too many females, it naturally starts going back to 50-50 for mathematical reasons. It's driven by this natural process. It's not God coming down and saying, there's a man and a woman. There's nothing enforcing that binary other than culture. And so even if, you know, sex and gender, they're influenced by biology, it doesn't necessarily give it moral or ethical meaning. You know, I look at it as trans people don't affect your life. So just let them live. and let them be. And the fact that society is in such a furor over such a tiny percentage of people just being slightly different from them is frankly absurd when we are just one rock in this whole big thing. And on that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you. Yeah, hand back there. A little. So there's often this idea that trans is a fad that's really taking off in recent times, especially amongst young people. First, so a lot of that, Michael Shermer, he has very problematic views on trans people. That's the short version. His views stem from an author, Abigail Schreier, who wrote a popular book recently that went into what you were saying. The short version is her book is just, it's not scientific. It's not, it would take me a whole hour to debunk her book. Trans people have always existed. And trans children have very strong concepts of their gender identity very early on. Those identities persist even with culture trying to get them to be not that, to not be trans. And when we look at those people, when they become adults, and even like 10 years later we check in on them, they don't detransition. They know they are trans. There's really not a lot of controversy there. What's actually happening is we're not isolated anymore. Most trans people went through the experience of, wow, I feel really weird and alien. I don't relate to my gender, and I don't get it, but I must just be the only one. And now there is finally just access to information. There's language out there that is out there on the internet, and you can be like, oh, that is how I feel. I'm not alone. I'm not the one weird freak having these weird feelings by myself. It's really more that, you know, we haven't been hiding the existence that transness exists, and so people are more brave about coming out. So there's also a lot of studies where they look at, like, you know, trans kids, a lot of trans children are given puberty blockers so that they can wait until they are 18 and fully adults and can then decide if they want to, you know, go on hormone replacement therapy and like fully kind of go through with it, which not all trans people are on HRT anyway. It's only like 30%, it's not everyone. And when you look at those like trans boys, is what they actually are, they stay trans boys and they stay trans men. It's in the 90%, they don't change their mind and they're very happy with their decision later. And ultimately, I think really where a lot of this fear comes from is that it's really rooted in misogyny, in that women are seen as not as smart, they're seen as incapable of making their own life choices and decisions, they're seen as easily influenced and swayed, and it's just not the reality. It's also rooted in misogyny in that a lot of people's determinants of worth of womanhood is based on being sexually attractive to men and popping out babies. And they're very threatened by the idea that there are a whole generation of people assigned female at birth who aren't subscribing to those norms of wanting to be sexually attractive to a man and pop out babies. And it's not that that's what's motivating them to transition, that's a side effect of it, but that's what culture is concerned about. So I would just say, like, if you hear those things, you should have a healthy dose of skepticism. I feel like I'm not doing it justice because, again, I could probably talk about that for hours, but just yeah, keep a skeptical mind about.
Why do you want so badly for me to not exist?
No, that's not, I'm not, that is not my personal, I'm not feeling the way or whatever. I'm just asking, because I'm trying to be skeptical. I mean, children are, they're human beings,
I think it'll go back to something I said in the beginning, in that no one transitions out of popularity. Transitioning is scary, especially for children. I was only able to transition because I basically tamped down feelings that I had since age 5 for 30 years until I was at a point where I was financially secure. I was at a company that was super progressive and I knew would not fire me if I came out. No one is doing it for whims, even children. And ultimately, I would say that the risk of a couple children thinking they're trans and later finding out they're not is worth it for the vast majority of trans people, trans children, to live the life that they want to live and to be happy. And really, that's why we give puberty blockers, so they can make the decision on their own. If you are a child who was on puberty blockers, you get to 18, you're like, no, that actually, I am my gender assigned at birth. There is no really detriment to having been on puberty blockers for that time. It's medically safe to do so. Like, you'll just start puberty later. So it is inherently coming from this fear that transness is bad. It's bad to be trans. That, like, oh, if my child makes the wrong choice of being trans when they're not, wow, what a terrible thing. But, like, why? Why is it a terrible thing if they think they're trans for a little bit? Like, there is nothing inherently bad with being transgender. Oh, yeah.
I figured since I'm over here, I could get your
Yeah, I wasn't looking there. Thank you.
I was wondering if I could add on a little bit about that topic. I used to work for the San Mateo County Pride Center as the youth program coordinator. So I interacted a lot with youth who were exploring their gender identities. And this included actually my niece, who for several years tried on a couple different names, tried on a couple different pronouns, before ultimately, as she approached adulthood, decided, yeah, actually, I do feel more comfortable identifying as a cis woman. I've also known a teenage boy who 6 months after he came out, his parents had worked so hard to start a brand new nonprofit in the coastal region and got him hormone treatment and, breast removal, everything within 6 months. And that kid was glowing. The way that he went from being a child that we were genuinely concerned about killing himself to a child that was thriving, and the sadness that I saw in children whose parents were afraid of puberty blockers. I've never seen a kid transition and end up worse for wear after.
Yeah, and I'm going to be bad at really summarizing that, but hopefully this summarizes it in that, like, if you look at the scientific studies, the rates of regret for going through, like, gender-affirming surgeries, top surgery, are lower than literally any other surgery out there. Like,
And it's usually based on external forces and pressures.
yes, it's like trans people don't regret going through that. So really, when you're having this fear of, like, well, what if the kid isn't actually trans and we're going through this, you need to think about not the 1%, I'm making up a number, that might actually end up still being cis and have just kind of gone through some thoughtful exploration for a while, which really doesn't matter. Like, their biology will continue once they're off blockers. You are saying it's more important to protect those cis children and to let all the trans children out there still have absurdly high rates of suicide and depression, because it's more important to make sure that a couple cis kids never think they're trans than to give support to trans children. Like, that's really what's being said in that moment. I see a question there. Also, someone stop me when we hit time, because I don't know when I have to stop.
Thank you.
Okay, 5 minutes.
So, is there a lot of data, research on, like, what percentage of folks who are trans get surgery and
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, is there research on like what percentage of trans people get either hormones or surgeries? I'm really bad at pulling numbers off my head if I don't have them written down, but I do know that like for surgery, it's even like 30%-ish. Like it's not 100% of trans people go on hormones. It's not 100% go on surgery. And part of that's because, you know, some people just don't want to. Like they don't necessarily just want to change their body. Like it can involve, I don't know, part of it can be social. Like if I start visibly looking different and growing facial hair, I might get fired from my job because I'm now openly transgender. Part of it is due to medical accessibility in that I'm very privileged in that I have a good job with good health insurance, and even with that good health insurance, I have to pay out of pocket a lot of money to get trans-affirming care. And so if you're poor, you might not be able to do that even if you want to. There's also a lot of gatekeeping in that I can only tell you how many different meetings I had to have with psychologists to prove to them that like I've researched this thoroughly and I am not making this on a whim. It's something I've literally been obsessing over the last 20 years, and I have a PhD in genomics, and I still have to convince them that I'm sound of mind to make my own decisions about my body. So there probably are more trans people out there who want to access that care than they just can. And it's definitely especially scary given the fall of Roe and just anything relating to privacy about what trans healthcare access is going to look like in the future. Because testosterone's, I don't remember which schedule something drug. Like it's very hard to get it. It's very regulated to get it. So there are a lot of hoops to jump through. It's not easy. Just be like, I went to my doctor and I got estrogen today. Like it does not happen in that way. It's so hard to actually get to that point, and that's part of the reason why you don't see people who are just like, oops, I thought I was trans and I'm not. Like very rarely that can happen, and often the reason people detransition is because they don't have supportive social environments and are kind of forced socially to detransition, and those are super rare compared to the bulk of what happens. Yeah.
The last statistic I heard about the percentage of trans persons in the U.S. was like 20, 30 years ago, it was like 1% or something like that. Now that we know more about the incredible variety of definable, I don't speak fast, so I don't know if definable is the right term, of people who don't fit into my whole
Yeah.
category, do we have a better understanding or a better estimate of how many people don't fit that criteria?
Yeah, so the question was, in the past, there's been a number out there, about 1% of people are trans. Is there better data out there, like how many people might fit in that category or not fit in like a strict gender binary? Again, I'm not super great with numbers if I don't have them prepared, but I do know that that number is going up. And again, that's why it seems like, oh, it's a fad because more people are identifying that way. But again, I go back to the example of like left-handedness, that like once you get, the societal, I broke it, no, I'm sorry. The societal pressures gone, that it does go up. And we do see in younger groups where, again, because there are less pressures that seeing it as bad, it does go up. And I'll also say part of it, it's not just because young people are more able to come out. A lot of trans people have not survived being trans. We have less trans elders because they couldn't get access to care, or they were murdered, or unable to openly transition out of fear. So a lot of what we see about, it seems like it's skewed young, it's probably the same across all age groups. It's just younger people who are finally able and brave enough and have the society in which they can feel like they can come out. Yeah. I think we have maybe time for one question. Or are we done? Thank you so much for giving me the time to speak on this today. Thank you.
I dare not use the microphone. We'll be back at 5.
Don't deafen everyone again.
There you go. How you feeling?
Oh, okay. I just turned it off and turned it back on again, so I don't know what happened. Hello? Is it me you're looking for? It's 5 p.m. on Saturday. We're all just ready to go dance now. Is this it? Oh. Yes. Yes. I should probably bring it closer to my actual face hole, though. One of the many that I have. You can intro me.
You have to turn the microphones on. Guy, microphones are hard to use, and I think that's one lesson we've learned this Skepticon weekend, among many others. All right, our next speaker is an ex-Muslim atheist feminist who has written at Skepchick and Free Thought blogs. They now blog at The Orbit, a social justice-oriented network of which they are a co-founder. Please welcome our last and coolest t-shirted speaker of the weekend, Eli Hannah Databoy.
Thank you, Lauren. It is an honor to again take the main stage here. I always make Lauren give me a workshop, so it always ends up happening. But when I get actually invited to be up here, that's always extra great. So since the theme is family, I decided I'm just going to take on that topic head on, partially because I have a minor suspicion that some of you here might have complicated relationships with your family for various reasons. Just a hint. So let's talk about this. But first, I'm going to give a little bit of a content notice. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about family conflict, because you can't talk about family without talking about family feuds. I'm going to touch on trauma and abuse, not super in depth. I am going to be showing some racist imagery, believe it or not. You know, if I will warn when that comes up. And we're going to be touching on death. So, you know, no judgment if you need to take a break or, you know, not look at the racist imagery. So I'm going to put all of you on the spot right now, if you so desire. So we're going to do the whole corny thing where we raise our hands and keep them up or put them down. So raise your hand if you have any living relatives from your biological/legal family of origin. If you have any who are still alive. All right. Put down your hand, or keep it up, rather. Keep it up if you have any of them that you still talk to. Any of them. Whether that's a great aunt, cousin, whatever. Okay, some hands went down. How many of us could say that our families know who we are more or less? So I'm not saying that you have like detailed descriptions of your sex life, but they basically know who you are. How many of us could say that our families acknowledge who we are more or less? And how many of us can say that we don't have to censor ourselves around our families? There it goes. So, yeah, I mean, we're all in, it's complicated, right? Facebook had its complicated, oh, you can all put your arms down, don't worry about it. Don't tire out your arms. We got to dance later, okay? So most of us have some kind of complication with our family. Facebook used to have an it's complicated status. It should have been for family, not romantic partners. We're not exactly a majority, those of us who can say there's estrangement or other dramatic things involved, but those numbers are going way the hell up. So estrangement issues are up all around. This is not just in the United States, it's all over the world. If you go into parents' forums where they are estranged from their children, they will talk about how they loved their kids too much, and that's why they're estranged. Or they'll say, our kids have no respect. Who raised those kids, though? You gotta wonder. Or they'll claim that a kid's spouse or romantic partner turned them against them. Or they'll say their kids are hard and unforgiving and cold. On the other hand, from the side of the children who are estranging themselves from their parents, you hear stories about abuse coming to light. You hear stories about how people feel that they no longer have to be loyal without question to family members who might be a Trump supporter or whatever else that they have a problem with. There's also a movement towards us understanding and healing from our own trauma, and sometimes those who gave us that trauma are not super helpful in that journey. It isn't really a new thing, this idea that we can heal from trauma and move forward and get rid of those in our lives who hold us back from that kind of healing. It's really a reclamation and a modernization of rituals, rites, and processes that have been in basically every culture since forever. Not to be super woo about it either, it's science, and if you read this book, you'll see it's called Burnout by the Nagoski sisters, and they talk about how stress is a cycle that we have to complete. It's not just about reducing stress, but most of us are carrying a stress burden, essentially. And so we're all starting to, maybe unlock, heal from all these things, and we find that people who are resistant to the concept are just an impediment to it, right? I would say that there is one incident that I can point to where I realized that there's a fundamental difference between people who have been, are, or who have ever considered estrangement from their families versus people who have never. This is a story about a weirdly, unconsciously racist thing that someone once said on a random Facebook group. I know, it sounds real exciting. So I'm in a group, a very highly specific group on Facebook, about neurodivergent people and how much trouble we have with basic humaning tasks like cleaning. And we share little tips and tricks and little brain hacks for, getting ourselves to clean up more. And bed sheets came up and staining, as can, happen. And somebody in the group claimed that those with a darker skin tone stain their sheets more. And I immediately go, oh no, because all I'm thinking is these ads from back in the day where they claimed that darker people were dirty. So I tried to be in good faith though. I responded and I said, do you realize what this sounds like? It doesn't sound good, friend. And her response was, she has a family that is Mediterranean and they range in skin tone, and within their family, they have a belief that those in their family with darker skin do stain the sheets more. And I'm like, yeah, but that has implications for other people too? And she said, I never thought to question it. And I realized, oh, people who have never had a reason to question things within their family sort of walk around with beliefs like that, which sounds really fake to me, but apparently some of you are like that. And I realized that what lay underneath that was trust. Trust is what most people think makes a family. It's sort of this mainstream idea that you don't have to earn trust within your family. You trust them, they trust you, you just sort of move along in that way. So if you have ever talked about having problems with your family or cutting off contact, I'm sure you've heard, but they're family. Most people who say that kind of suck or just don't realize that they suck, because there are toxic traits within the traditional concepts of family. If you have built into your family the idea that you have to unquestioningly obey, you're probably in a more hierarchical family structure. But even less hierarchical families have their flaws, because the idea is you always give your family credit. You don't fight them too much, you hold your tongue, you assume they're good people, always acting in good faith. And you accept them no matter what. Of course, that has downsides for the whole world sometimes. You get your traditional crime families. And even in those families, there are people who aren't biologically or even through marriage related, but they'll say, we're family, the family. Then there's cults, which is a whole other thing that I'm not going to get into, but they often have pseudo-family structures because they're banking on the idea of trust. We consider you family now, which means you can't question us and you got to listen to us. Which plays into this idea. Oh, I switched the order of the slides there. When you hear your family at Olive Garden, right? But it's a very hierarchical relationship, right? You as the customer are getting your ass kissed by some poor underpaid server in the hopes of maybe you giving them some money so they can pay their rent. So it's another hierarchical model, which plays into the idea that you should want to work to benefit the American society that is sort of like a family. You know, you have to want to work, even if you're completely underpaid for it and treated like shit, because we're a family. By the way, if you ever apply for a job and they say we're like a family, don't walk, run. Religion plays into this too, which, by the way, as somebody who doesn't come from a Christian background, I find Christianity to have the weirdest family fake structure that's going on. Like Mary and God is mommy and daddy, kind of weird. Father and son is the same thing, but not also extra weird to me. It's all very weird. But when I think about Islam, which is the religion that I came from, we all called each other, we said we were brothers and sisters in Islam. Unless you were like a hip, new kind of Muslim and you'd say, we're all brothers and sisters in humanity. But they're all brothers and sisters that you can marry? Like that's just ends up sounding real weird. Where in Christianity, the siblinghood is through being God's children, which to a Muslim is pretty blasphemous. God's not allowed to have kids. We are all children of God, and he left us in a hot car. And not to mention the extra weirdness that is all the killing of children that happens in the Bible. I guess America doesn't want to be like the Bible, so we're banning abortion so that there's less child killing. I don't know. I don't actually consider, fetuses to be children. But if you don't know the story of Abraham, if you're looking at the Islamic version, it's Ishmael. In the biblical one, it's Isaac. But God tells Abraham, go kill your son, go slit his throat. And then at the last minute goes JK and gives him a ram. What? I always imagine Ishmael going, so Dad, what was that about? What happened just there? So if we pivot away from the idea that the people to whom you owe some kind of genetic or other allegiance, and you move towards the concept of chosen family, I would be remiss by not starting with the queer history of the idea of a chosen family, because a lot of people on the LGBTQIA, etc. spectrum end up becoming separated, whether physically or partially or fully emotionally, from their families of origin. And so we end up creating these, what we call chosen family structures. In fact, back in the day, if you're an old gay, you know this, you would ask, are they family? And that would mean either that they are also gay or they are an ally. That's what family meant. And back then, ally inclusion was important within that definition because there were so few allies. Now, well, before it used to be that sometimes people would hide in the word ally to not come out. I did that in high school, by the way. I was in a headscarf in the Gay Straight Alliance as an ally, very aggressively doing all of the activism. And, that came back to haunt me. So, people would hide in the ally identity, and now they're more likely to actually come out. So now people hide behind the ally identity. I'm an ally, therefore you cannot question my behavior. So again, the concept of family comes up again. You should believe that I am part of you, and you are part of me, so anything I do is fine. There's also a concept that's sort of newer within queer circles. It's not that new, but it's newer as far as terminology goes, which is the queer platonic partner, which people outside of the community go in and say, isn't that just best friends? But it's not. It's basically someone who you may or may not have sexual or romantic relationship with, but who is very much family to you. So these concepts have been around for a while. And even people outside of the LGBTQIA spectrum are starting to pick up on the idea of chosen family because there are more reasons to be estranged from your family. But there's downsides to this too, because once you put the term family on it, often all of the baggage of family comes up. And we end up replaying the same patterns that we brought with us into the space. It took me a long time to figure this out. I hope all of you have by now. Just because you have certain things in common with somebody doesn't mean they're going to make good family for you. A lot of us found that out when we thought everybody who called themselves an atheist would be on our sides. We all know that's not true. The great schisms happened more than 10 years ago now. Then there's the issue of sexual and romantic tension, because generally speaking, depending on where you're from and who you are, I guess, your family of origin, there's not going to be a lot of sexual or romantic tension between members of the family. But within queer chosen families, that can happen, because there are people who are around who maybe you dated before or want to date. So while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it does add a variable to the equation. There's also the issue of, do you always stand by everyone within your chosen family, or what is the action that they take that's far enough for you to say, you are no longer part of my family? Because estrangement is difficult, whether it's chosen or family of origin. There's also the concept of a statute of limitations. So I find this happens between all kinds of families. But there are people who believe that even if you said something 10 years ago, as long as you haven't contradicted it since, you must still hold that belief. And then there are people who seem to believe that if I said something 10 years ago and haven't validated it since then, you can't hold me to it. And because we don't have these explicit conversations about how we think about it, it ends up causing clashes. I'm in the second party, or rather the first party. I really don't think that if you say something to me and you never contradict it, why should I think you believe the opposite now? What reason have you given me? And that causes conflict. Hopefully we talk it through as a crew. If you know, you know. The idea is that maybe before we have conflicts, we should discuss how we have conflicts. People talk about love languages, and it's a concept that has limited utility, and I know it comes from Christian writers, don't at me. But there's also a concept of apology languages. If somebody has truly done you wrong and truly wants to make amends with you, how do they approach that? The worst time to have that conversation is after they've pissed you off or you've pissed them off. You're not in a place to actually have a good, healthy conversation about what is right. So, radical idea, maybe do it while you're on good terms. Like a prenup, right? Say, all right, we're having our little friendship or whatever other relationship discussion about, if I really mess up and I know I did wrong, what do you want from me? Do you want space, or do you want me to close the space between us? Do you want an explanation of how I messed up, how I got to that place, or do you just want me to say sorry? There's so many elements to apologies, but we don't have these conversations ahead of time, and it causes all these conflicts. And if you're at all familiar with the concept of the geek social fallacies, and if you're not, you should look them up, there's a lot of issues that come up because we assume a transitive property. If I like somebody, they will like everybody that I like. That's not true. Sometimes there are things that are incompatible between people that you may not know. Sometimes you may think that someone is misunderstood and misjudged if somebody else rejects them socially. You may think, oh, I was misunderstood and misjudged and socially rejected, so that person over there must also be wronged. And that may not be true. Maybe they actually did something wrong. Maybe they're that guy, like the ones that came up at last night's panel, if you were there. You know, sometimes you do have to give people the boot in order to make it a safer place for everybody else. There's also this thing that a lot of people do where we linger on the formative years, where maybe high school was 20, 30, 40 years ago, but you still think of yourself as that sad little kid crying in a corner, because some part of you still is. But you can't keep thinking of yourself as that person as you interact with other people, because that's not who they know. They're seeing the person they see in front of you. This is a self-crit, by the way. So how do we find the balance between the good ideas from the old model versus the complicated, chaotic, disorganized, but dynamic new model? What can we build from this? What can we take from the different sides of it? So I wasn't going to get personal with this talk. That was not my intention. I did not intend to get emotional about it either. But now, as I move forward in this talk, I'm going to warn you, I might make myself cry. That's because I figured out that now that I have beard and no breasts rather than the other way around, I'm allowed to be emotional, and people won't accuse me of being hysterical. So I'm going to talk about my grandmother, who recently passed away. You will not see a picture of her because it's not my place to decide to project her image to all of you. I will be sparse on certain details because not everything is my story to tell. But I think there's a lot there that I can share about my relationship with her. In life, she was a real anxious person. And as a kid, I did not understand it. She wouldn't let me and my sister play upstairs because she was worried we would crash through the window and fall to our deaths. She was that kind of person. She also just was very fearful, and I just never understood it as a young person. I also didn't notice her good traits because as a kid, I just saw her as a blocker, as an impediment to my child freedom. But as I got older, I started to figure out I kind of understood her. Turns out I am also a very anxious person. It just manifests in very different ways. The thing I most associate with her, and that sort of demonstrates my change in mentality, is of all things oral hygiene. She was always on our case to brush our teeth, to freshen our breaths, to learn how to scrape our tongues and do all these things. So she died recently. She was in her 80s. She died with all of her teeth intact. So she was onto something. These were her weakness, though, the orange Tic Tac. They have sugar in them. They could erode your teeth. But even she, the devotee of the cult of oral health, let herself have a Tic Tac every once in a while. She also really liked to use cardamom pods to freshen her breath. It's a very, very Indian thing. So that's me back in the day. This has a point, by the way. I'm not just showing off how cute I used to be. So, aw. Well, I'll go back to this just for a moment. So my grandmother, I saw her as an impediment in many ways, as an enforcer of rules, especially around religion and modesty. Because when I used to wear a headscarf, if my skirt came up a little bit and you could see a little bit of my hairy leg, she would warn me to cover my leg. And I remember thinking, why is she like this, you know? And I realized that to her, it was her way of protecting me. And back then, I believed in Islam, and she thought she was helping me. The minute I left Islam, she stopped doing that. Once I said I was no longer Muslim, she left me alone about those things. And I found out years later that one of my uncles, he's not religious at all, and he raised his kids pretty secularly. She never was on their case to be religious. She only brought it up and only tried to enforce it with people who had opted in, which honestly is incredible given the way even much younger people in my family reacted to me leaving Islam. Honestly incredible. So I bring this picture up because I found out after she died the truth about why she kept on loving me even after I left Islam. Because even though the fact that I'm a Muslim who no longer is a Muslim is plastered all over the internet, it's not like everyone was informing all of the elders in my family about my change of heart. You know, I didn't go up to them and be like, hey, Grandma, I'm an atheist now. The closest I got to that was saying, oh yeah, I'm not wearing a headscarf anymore. That's about as close as I got. So when my grandmother died, I didn't know if she knew I was an apostate. All I knew was that she had kept on loving me, which did mean a lot, and that she had stopped trying to enforce modesty on me, which meant a lot too. I found out that I was so wrong because my mother, who was very close to her mother, went to her mother for advice, as people in good relationships with their parents do, and said, I don't know what's going on with my kid. My kid's saying they're not Muslim anymore. I'm really scared. I'm really hurt. I really want to, I don't know if I should cut this kid off to teach them a lesson or keep them in my life. And my grandmother said, she's your daughter, And if you decide she's not your daughter, you're not my daughter. And this picture is so I divorced my husband, who's on the other side of this picture, but this picture still means so much to me because the reason why I looked like a proper Indian bride was my grandmother, because her way of showing affection about this was to tell my mother when she found out that I had eloped with my then husband, she said, "Ine dulhan banawije," and it means literally make her into a proper bride. So she wanted to make sure my mother spent the money on it and made sure that I got to be the bride. Which really felt like cosplay for me, but it was fun, in its way. And this was after I had eloped, by the way. She knew that I had secretly eloped, and she still wanted to make sure that I felt like I was a part of things. She modeled a less toxic way of approaching family in ways I had no idea of, and even other people in my family didn't know until after she died, and people started showing up at my uncle's house and at her funeral and telling their stories. She was not a black sheep, but she was queen of the black sheep, it turns out. She loved every single little black sheep in the family. I was not the only one. Loyalty can be bad and it can also be good. In my grandmother's case, she managed to walk the line. She was never blindly loyal to anybody. In fact, she almost cut off one of her nephews because he had abused his daughter. She ended up just kind of distancing herself from him, but kept in touch with the daughter. She kept the daughter in the loop on the family, and she made sure that any event that her dad was going to be at, or not going to be at, that the daughter was invited. And she stood up to abusers like my own father in her own way. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it wasn't the way I would do it, because I'm pretty dramatic and loud, but she did it her own way. She also did something that was very controversial for her time and in her cultural context. So within certain cultures, and actually within American culture not too long ago, it was acceptable to marry your cousin. Please hold your ears, okay? It's a very modern thing that y'all don't marry your cousins either. Very modern. And it was actually based on racist ideas of social Darwinism. Look it up. It always goes back to eugenics, right? Everything is secretly eugenics in America. So in any case, my grandmother, despite being from a culture that was very accepting, if not advocating, cousin marriage to keep the wealth in the family, that usually was the mindset, and also from sort of, a culture and religion where that was allowed, she always refused any offer of marriage that came from within the family. She had 5 daughters, and all the proposals that came from their cousins, she immediately vetoed. And it wasn't because she had some Western ideals or whatever. It was because she said, if you marry 2 cousins and they have conflict, because romantic and sexual relationships have conflict, turns out, then you're separating families. You're forcing siblings to go against each other. And she thought that that was incredibly distasteful. So she always stood up against that. So she wanted things to be as healthy as they possibly could be. She was also a master of discretion without secrecy. And this is something, as Americans, I'm including myself in it, we're pretty bad at. We have the idea that in order to accept each other and truly love each other, we have to scream every fact about ourselves at each other until someone gets mad and runs off. She was a master of knowing when to say something and when not to say something. It's why she never told me, I know you're a dirty, filthy atheist and I love you anyway. She knew that wasn't the best way to approach me, that the way for us to stay grandchild and grandmother was for her to just love and accept me and show me that she accepted me by stopping trying to get me to do religious acts. My less religious family continued, despite knowing explicitly that I was an atheist, to try and force me to do religious stuff. My devoted grandmother never did. Not once. Not after she found out. She also had incredible attention to detail and memory. I used to roll my eyes at this, but if I was ever at a family wedding, which for Indian families is like hundreds of people, and they're all relatives, by the way, she would introduce me to someone and say, do you know how you're related to them? And my aunt, no. And she would go through sort of the family tree, you know, your cousins, brothers, nephews, former roommate. That's Spaceballs, actually. But, you know, she would, and it was her way of saying, this is how you're connected to this person. You know, they're not just some rando, they're connected to you, they're here, you know. And there were people who she introduced to me that way who I actually did get genuinely close to. I made friends that way. My mother carries on that tradition because my mother, so within Indian families, if you have a family gathering, there's multiple kinds of bread you can have. It's not just naan. There's like multiple kinds of naan. And usually you have multiple kinds at your family gathering because everybody has their preference. My mother knows everyone's bread preference to a T. Not only which bread they want, but how they want it heated up. Microwave, toaster, or over an open flame. Or even cold. Some weirdos want it cold, you know, it's fine. So she knows, and she's just like my grandmother in that way. Probably the most touching thing about my grandmother was that she cared about cats because of me. She didn't exactly grow up with pets. Animals to her were street animals. I don't think she ever willingly pet a cat in her life, but she would always ask me, how are your kitties doing? How many are you fostering right now? Because I'm involved with animal rescue. She would ask me, is there a mom with her babies? And if I would mention it, she would coo over it. Oh, aren't they so cute? And one time she came to visit me in my apartment, and she saw the kittens running around and playing, and she's like, do you have a ball for them to play with? Don't they like to play with balls? Even though she had no idea. And I would do fundraisers for my rescue, and my mom's donations would always be matched by my grandmother's, every single time. So she would not have pet this beautiful cat named Suyen, but she still showed her love of me through loving these cats. She was also really great at vulnerability and intimacy. She, despite being sort of a quiet, loving type, she always knew who she was, and she never apologized for it. And she also never questioned other people's innocent preferences. You know, if your preferences don't harm anyone, why do you care? Which, I mean, with families like mine, everybody usually meddles a whole lot. Like, I don't like my food piping hot. I like it kind of lukewarm, I know. And I had relatives who would take my plate from my hands, put it in the microwave, set it to over 9,000, and bring back lava for me to eat, because that's what they like. They're like, why are you eating ice cold food? And I'm like, because I want to. My grandmother never cared, and in fact, she remembered how warm I liked it. And that's just an example of just the kind of person that she was. And to go up to my dad, my grandmother never openly rebelled against my dad or said anything against him, even though he was abusive. But as soon as my mother left him, despite being, you know, an older person, my mother was worried she'd get rejected. She worried her mom would say, no, you shouldn't divorce. And her mom instead turned to her and said, I can't believe I let you marry that man. She said, you know, I wanted to wait till you had left and you were ready to leave, but I can't believe that I let you, and I'm glad you're out. A woman in her 80s from a conservative religious culture. Which brings me to the prayer beads. These are called tasbih in Arabic/Islamic parlance. When my grandmother was dying, she pressed this little baggie with this little set of prayer beads into my mother's hands and said it was for me. And when my mother had gone to see her mother off to her death, I had told her, bring something back. I don't care what it is, just something so I can think of her. But my mom didn't have to figure it out. My grandmother gave her something, which, by the way, my grandmother has a lot of grandkids and great-grandkids, and she singled me out for this specifically. And my mother didn't tell me till she came back, and she pressed it into my hand just like her mother had, and when I pulled it out, I immediately recognized them. Because not only were they the ones she'd been using for years, she had bought it on a trip to Saudi Arabia where she was taking care of me and my sister. And in fact, I had oohed and awed at the prayer beads with her, and she had chosen these because we both liked them. Normally, prayer beads have like tassels that are made out of some weird material, but these had like little chains, which I liked because they felt sturdy and they felt cool. So I knew exactly what she was trying to tell me. She wasn't trying to tell me, you better be religious and pray on these. She was telling me, I have always loved you and I will always love you. So even though I'm not a praying type by any means anymore, these have a special place in my heart and in my life. So now when I consider, so now when I think about a positive, healthy model for what a family should be, yeah, I think about the abstract. I gave a whole talk about it, right? Yeah, I think about patterns and social issues and social cues and chosen family versus family of origin and the complications that come along with all of that. Of course I think about all that. But nowadays, I try to focus more about what I can do and who I can be. I can't make everyone be nice to each other. I can't make people talk through their understandings in a calm way. I can't force people to be generous and charitable in their interpretations of each other. I can't get many members of my extended family to take my side over my documented abusive fathers. What I can do, and what I hope to do, to be a person who keeps and maintains strong and healthy family ties whenever and however I can. And even though I might be living and looking like a very, very different person from my grandmother, which I am, basically what I've landed on is be more like Nanima. And that's about it. I think we can do questions now. That is my co-cat dad, Junpei. She is very cute. We'll leave her up. And I saw another hand in the back, I believe. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes.
I don't know what exactly the idea of parents having chosen families started.
That's one of those things where we can't really know for sure, but we know it goes back as early as like the 20s and 30s.
Okay. I know that it's definitely, I was looking up which papers kind of putting that, but I know that in how to use incest sex abuse survivor circles, it's very common to, in fact, Andrew Bacchus, who's a writer, coined the term children of the secret, abuse, children who have abuse history, trauma history. And it's very common for children in those circles to grow up in as adults and have chosen families, often because they find to cut themselves off from the grown up. So that's another case of where there is a deliberate intent to put yourself off from the negative toxic families and choose your own family.
It's true, you know, and there's a parallel there too, because, you know, you are more likely to be abused by your family if you are LGBTQIA anywhere around there. You know, I didn't exactly come out at a young age. It took me freaking forever. But my dad picked on me more than my siblings. That definitely happened. Sometimes abusers just pick up on certain vulnerabilities and they go after you for them. And he knew I was trying to prove myself and that I would do anything to prove myself.
Sometimes people have scapegoats, is what we call it in the social.
I was actually a golden child. But he was harder on me because of it. My sister was a scapegoat, but as adults we switched roles. So we get to commiserate about how both roles suck and fuck abusers. Really, the grass is not greener, I promise you. Any other questions? No? Yes.
All right, so chosen family versus the idea that you can't choose your family, right? You know that trope that you don't choose what family you're born into. And there's, sorry. Well, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
it's bullshit, but I think also when you were talking about your experience with your grandmother, that's a situation where you were born into this family,
That's a really interesting idea, sort of the interplay between chosen family versus family you don't choose. I actually, a long time ago, like when I first became an atheist, like 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, I had someone in my family who was fine with it at first, but then completely distanced herself from me. And I felt comfortable enough with her where I reached out to her and I said, what's going on? She said, oh, you keep talking about chosen family, and you say chosen family and not family of origin. And I said, I've still chosen you. You know, you can be my blood relative and I can still choose to add you into my chosen family structure. I have kept you in. You know, you can do that too. And it's true. Most of the people in my blood family, if I was not related to them, how would I have met them? At the mosque? Like, no, it wasn't going to happen. Or even someone like my mother, it brings such a valuable perspective into my life that I have people in my life who are religious and a little bit more traditional and who don't live on the internet to give me a reality check. To give a quick example, it's a little bit, but here we go. So when the Elliot Rodgers shooting happens, my mother asked me, what was going on with him? Was he some bullied child? And I had to explain insults to her. And she looked at me and she said, why do you know all this? And I said, Ma, I ask myself that every day. Yeah. You know, they're both equally as valid, and you can build your own, you know, you can cobble together whatever you need.
And that's really what my question was.
Yeah.
That relationship between perceptual, important, cultural importance and subcultural importance.
And in the case of relatives who kept me in their life, they really did choose me. They chose me over the entire community turning against me, people within my own family turning against me, their religion telling them I ought to be shunned. They chose me over that. That's a big deal. And I give them a lot of credit, and I extend a lot of generosity to them because of that. And it wasn't just the apostasy, by the way. I've had multiple things over the years come up where more and more people shunned me from my former community. But some people have stuck around anyway, and they still love me, and that means a lot. They chose me too. That's true. Yes. I mean, it does help that I have a giant family, so statistically, they're more likely to be one who can put up with me. Yes. I think that has to be the last one, or where are we on time? Oh, okay, more than I thought. Okay.
Anybody else have a question before I just like keep harassing Eli? Okay. All right. So now I'm thinking about when we choose to leave someone, right? Or when we are chosen, I guess unchosen, right? You just mentioned like how good it feels to be chosen, and I've noticed that oftentimes in like my chosen family, it almost hurts more when somebody who's not blood related then decides to reject me. What are the patterns you've observed in our shared community, and how would you handle them?
You kind of know the answer. It's okay. Yeah, no, I'll talk about it a little bit. Yes, I know. So chosen family is tough in so many ways that I barely touched on. But one of the things that is really hard is when there's a breakup of any kind, platonic, non-platonic, whatever, and people sometimes choose sides, or there are accusations flying of various kinds, and you're not sure what to do or if you should do anything. You may feel obligated to pick a side, or maybe you yourself want to sort of keep things discreet, but things pop up, or the other person starts talking smack, and you're like, well, I guess I have to now. Because otherwise everybody's going to think I'm the bad one. And the sad part is usually the first person to complain publicly is taken seriously, even though they may not be the right one. So that's tough, and it does hurt more, I think, when you, so think about it. It's not just that they chose you and you chose them and there's an unchoosing. There's also the fact that you're dealing with the trauma of rejection from your former family. So you've already come out of one family structure, at least to some extent, and you're like, okay, I'm safe now. I can choose the people I'm around and I can be choosy. I can use my discretion. I can look for green flags and run away from red flags. But sometimes you're so wrong, or they change, or there are things you couldn't have known that come up. I think just the double trauma of rejection can really, really make things worse. In addition to the fact that maybe you feel a little sheepish. How did I not know? How did I not see the signs? Am I just not very good at life? We've all had these thoughts, or maybe I have, I don't know. But, that's, I think, what makes it extra hard. And especially if you're talking about groups like, say, non-religious people or LGBTQIA people, we also feel rejected from society as a whole, not just our families. There are multiple overlapping circles of people who basically don't want us. And so when the unwanted find each other and then unwant each other, it's just exponentially horrific. And it can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. That's not to say you shouldn't build chosen families. It's just to say that it's kind of expected that sometimes there will be bad times. And that you can't be perfect, and all you can do is sort of take the lessons, if there are any, and move on. I very recently learned sometimes there is no lesson. Sometimes there is no lesson in bad things. A bad breakup, whatever. Sometimes you just kind of have to pick up the pieces and figure out what you're going to do next. Sometimes there's no secret meaning or code to it. And the room is silent. Yes.
I don't really know how to address this, but one of my chosen family, she is
Mm-hmm. It's true. When you have a difference in worldview as fundamental as religion or lack of religion, that can really have a profound effect on how you assess a relationship and what you say and how you do. And in case you didn't know, religions have caused conflicts all over the world. Like a lot. So of course, interpersonally, they're going to do similar things too. For me personally, and I can only speak to me personally, I do have relationships with religious people within my family, and even some chosen people in my life are religious. What it comes down to is sort of, what hills am I willing to die on? I ask myself that question. If they say something I don't like or I want to question, I'm like, am I willing to die on this hill? Am I willing to potentially risk something? And that's not to say I'm afraid to engage with them, but occasionally I might say, I think this is a topic we disagree on, and I'm not really in a place to be kind in my disagreement with you. Can we talk about something else? Or sometimes it's setting really hard boundaries. That's honestly the only way I'm still talking to certain of my relatives. They kept saying, oh, we accept you, we love you, but then they'd bring up religion. I mean, they bring up religion all the time because they're religious people. It's part of their life. They pray 5 times a day. They cover themselves. They fast in Ramadan. They're targeted by the Republican Party. There's a lot that goes into being a Muslim, It's part of your life, so they're going to bring up religion. And I also had to learn to not take it personally that they brought up religion. Because sometimes they weren't trying to shade me. Like, they weren't saying, thank God for a nice thing, to say, you don't get any credit for this thing. They're saying it because that's what they say. Just like I would say, whoop. It's the same thing. And I mean, like, maybe I'm thinking about cats because of this slide, but like, cats have different ways of communicating than humans. We just kind of figure them out and try to communicate with them. Dogs, any other non-human animals. And that's not to say religious people are a different species, but I sort of mentally translate sometimes. I'm like, this is what they're saying. And, it's not black and white. I'll pray for you, we all know can be passive aggressive and shady. It can also be a genuine expression of, I'm thinking of you. And yes, it bothers me still sometimes when someone tells me they're praying for me. I'm like, can you just give me $5 instead? But I think about the people I love all the time, even when I'm not around them. And if their way of thinking about them is to ask what they believe to be a supreme being for good things for me, okay, I guess. I mean, that's not to say I have to pray with them or they can pray in front of me. It's what they do in their private time. Like, I'm not the thought police, despite what some people might think. You know, I'm not going to tell people what to do in their private time in that way, you know. But yeah, it's a balance, though. I've changed my mind on so many things over the years. I cannot tell you. I don't even remember all the shifts in thinking I had, because I went from being hypersensitive to being overcompensating to ignoring, to putting distance, to almost cutting people off. I've gone all over the place because it's an emotional process. And despite what some people who might also think that I'm the thought, you can't not have emotions, by the way. And thinking that you're effective and never have emotions is proof of how overly emotional you are. You're welcome, yeah. Sorry there wasn't a straight answer. Nothing I produce is straight. I'm very sorry. All right, I think that's about it. Then we can all go get ready for prom a little early. But Stephanie has something to say, I believe. Yes.
So prom is at 9, if anybody didn't already know that. We did have 2 good proposals for guerrilla workshops. So at 2 p.m. tomorrow, Dell, who was our MC last night, will be in this room talking about working with your employers to get some progress out of capitalism, something they're very good at. In this room, Nadia sort of jokingly suggested that she talk about class, so I'm holding her to that. We also have a raffle going this year. If you haven't already taken a look when you head out into the vendor stuff, there's a table with a bunch of pink bags. You can put the tickets in there. You can get the tickets from Lois at the registration desk. I think that's everything. Thank you. Here. Yep. Anything else? All right. I will see all your lovely outfits at 9.